It is my distinct honor to introduce Kevin Nguyen. He's a senior editor at GQ magazine, where he writes about books, music, and popular media. White Tears is his favorite book, and it's mine too. He read in 2017, quote, by a mile, calling it, quote, a tremendous, smart, and weird book. Kevin was formerly a book reviewer for Grantland and has published in the Paris Review, The New Republic, The Atlantic, and The Millions. Please welcome Kevin Nguyen, who will be moderating tonight.
I didn't realize how embarrassing it would be sitting next to you while she was reading all this praise I have for your book. How many people have read White Tears? Gods Without Men? What about, okay, here's a real one. The iPad app that Adam has put out. It's really good. It's an iPad app. Anyway, yes, Hari, incredible author. He's going to read from White Tears, which, as I said earlier, my favorite book from last year by a mile. So Hari Kunzru, everyone.
Let's do the obligatory height thing. Hello. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, AAWW will always have a special place in my heart as well, because they were the first people to invite me to come and read when I moved to the city 10 years ago. And so, yeah, and it always feels like coming home to be back here. Thank you, Kevin, for that fine introduction and the sort of embarrassing experience of the show of hands, which I hope never to have to repeat. The iPad app thing, which clearly, which was cool, and immediately, of course, about a week after it came out, the company went bust, which is actually relevant to this project. It was something I made as part of the research for this thing, because as I'll read out a little bit from the beginning. It was about the experience of walking around the city wearing this particular kind of recording setup, these little binaural mics in my ears, and trying to understand the city by way of sound rather than vision. And it was all about a street musician called Moondog, who used to busk in Midtown many years ago. A blind guy who dressed as a Viking and made this extraordinary, very formal kind of fugue music on his own instruments. He designed and built instruments, and thinking about how a blind person would negotiate this very, very busy and complex urban space was kind of got me to thinking about sound, and then eventually was one of the things that led me to this. So I'm going to read a little bit from the very beginning of this novel, and then which is set in the present day, and then and another very short section which is set back in the 1950s. And since this is the beginning, you need no further context. Other than the fact that I need my glasses to see at a distance, and then it's weird trying to look at the book. So now I can't see you, which makes it kind of more comfortable for me. That summer, I'd ride my bike over the bridge, lock it up in front of one of the bars on Orchard Street, and drift through the city on foot, recording people and places, sidewalk smokers, lovers' quarrels, drug deals. I wanted to store the world and play it back just as I'd found it, without change or addition. I collected audio of thunderstorms, music coming out of cars, the subway trains rumbling underfoot. It was all reality, a quality I'd lately begun to crave, as if I were deficient in some necessary vitamin or mineral. I had a binaural setup, 2 little mics in my ears that looked like headphones, a portable recorder clipped to my belt under my shirt. It was discreet. No one ever noticed. I could roam where I liked and then ride home and listen back through Carter's $1,000 headphones at the studio. There were always phenomena I hadn't registered, pockets of sound I'd moved through without knowing. Every sound wave has a physiological effect, every vibration. I once heard a field recording of a woman singing, sitting on a porch. You could hear her foot tapping, keeping time. You could hear the creak of her rocking chair, the crickets in the trees. You could tell it was evening because of the crickets. I felt I was slipping. If I wasn't careful, I'd lose my grip on the present and find myself back there, 70 or 80 years in the past. the rough board floor, the overhang of the roof, her voice traveling through the moist, heavy air to the diaphragm of the microphone, its sound converted into electrical energy, frozen, then the whole process reversed. Electricity moving a speaker cone, sound spilling into my ears and connecting me to that long ago time and place. I could feel it flow, that voice, inhabiting the cavities of my body, displacing the present like water filling a cistern. I heard Charlie Shaw on one of those recording walks. It was evening. I don't remember why I'd gone out. Perhaps I couldn't sleep. That happened. Perhaps I just needed to be outside or spend some time on my own. I often felt claustrophobic after long sessions. We could spend 12 hours in the studio without coming up for air. It was hot. The stifling New York heat that empties the city on July and August weekends. My shirt was clinging to my back. Passers-by were sheened in sweat, everyone desperate for the weather to break. I was recording by the chess tables on Washington Square. A guy called PJ, evidently the home favorite, was playing another man whose name I didn't catch. They'd drawn a little crowd. There was money on the table. A bottle was being passed around. PJ was one of the hustlers who sit at those tables day in, day out, playing all comers for $10 a time. He was a flabby white man in his 50s or 60s with thick glasses and several plastic bags of nameless crap stashed under the bench. The other player was skinny and black. Hard to say how old because his face was hidden under a baseball cap. He wore a clean white undershirt and baggy blue jeans. His bare arms were painfully thin like 2 twists of fuse wire. This man was taking his time over his moves. Enough for some of the onlookers to be muttering and telling him to make up his mind. He ignored them. Unlike PJ, who was chatting to his buddies, he kept his head down and seemed absorbed in the game. He was a good player, and soon he forced PJ to give up a knight, then his queen. "There goes my rent money," said PJ to anyone who'd listen. He was stuck on the phrase, repeating it until it became a tic, each bad move. "There goes my rent money. There it goes." Something about the stranger was making the spectators nervous, too. He'd reach over the table, settle his long fingers on a piece, move it, then suddenly bring his palm slapping down on the clock. Each time he did it, an audible flinch traveled through the crowd. Coughing, keys fondled in pockets. It was killing PJ, showing no mercy, and they didn't like it. "Mate in 2, said the thin man, almost under his breath. Around the board, people fell silent. PJ nodded glumly and knocked down his king with a forefinger. "Shoot," he said, "now what am I going to do?" As his friends gathered around to commiserate, the stranger counted his winnings, a wad of small bills. I was already turning away when I heard him sing. It was a blues, just a line. "Believe I buy a graveyard of my own," he sang. Then he repeated it. "Believe I buy me a graveyard of my own." On the audio, I can hear the change in the position of my head, the mics over each ear picking up a slightly different range as I swing round to listen. I don't know how to explain what happens next. My memory is clear. There was a skater, a girl. You can hear the rumble of a deck, but it's in the background. I distinctly remember turning to watch her. I saw long black hair, tattooed sleeves, a nice arse and cut-offs weaving between dog walkers. How would I know that if I hadn't turned? But the audio shows I didn't. The singer remains in the same spot. I remember that when I turned back, the game had broken up. It felt strange. It had only taken a few seconds for the girl to pass, but already the players and spectators were gone, the tables completely deserted. At the time, I didn't think too much about it. I was hungry, so I walked over to 6th Avenue to get a slice. So this snatch of this fragment of a blues song that Seth, the narrator, has heard leads him into a kind of entanglement with history. I mean, the book becomes a sort of ghost story about the kind of connection between present day hipster musicians and the past, which perhaps is darker and more ugly than they want to face. I'll read a very little bit that's set amongst a kind of similar, there's a very similar kind of guy, a similar sort of age narrator, but this is back in the 1950s, and this is another young man speaking, and the two of these characters become, the boundaries between them get a little blurred, a little fuzzy. How long ago? That doesn't matter. Far back in time, drowned in the crackle and hiss. I was 19 years old, living in a sixth-floor walk-up in Greenwich Village, and working as a messenger at the New York Herald Tribune, running copy between reporters and editors in the newsroom of their building on 41st Street. Long gone, that newsroom, that paper. I was a jazz fanatic, but I had no time for the modern stuff, no Miles or Coltrane for me, no bebop, which I called Chinese jazz because it was all splintered and broken up. I was what they used to term a hot collector, obsessed with the music of the 20s. To me, that was the real deal, the source and origin. Like every other dumb kid starting down that particular road, my god was Bix Beiderbecke. I didn't know a thing. On my lunch breaks, I'd hang around at a store in Midtown we all knew it as Indian Joe's, digging in the crates. I'd buy any old crap for 8 bars of Bix. One day, doesn't matter how, I tumbled to the idea that what I loved didn't come from Davenport, Iowa. As my taste changed, I started to take the subway uptown to Apollo Music at 125th and Lenox on the hunt for King Oliver, or Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. New Orleans became my city. New Orleans and its great founding myth, the sound of the drummers in Congo Square vibrating through young Buddy Bolden's ears and on into the pulse of America. It was my fantasy to hear Bolden, the one who came before King Oliver and all the other band leaders, the one who was never recorded, whose sound was the missing link to the past. Buddy Bolden vanished into the silence. I dreamed of being the one who uncovered in some dusty basement or thrift store backroom a cache of wax cylinders, my ears the first in 50 years to receive the gift of Bolden's cornet, its sweet high tone piercing the veil. I know that by that time I had heard some blues, by which I mean country blues, not commercial female nightclub singers backed by jazz bands, your Ma Rainey's and Mamie Smiths and so forth. And what I'd heard I hadn't found too interesting. To me, Lead Belly sounded corny. All that God Almighty, I can pick a bale of cotton horse shit. I mean, you want the truth? He was still in the pen, metaphorically speaking, while Lomax Pear was leading him around those so-called progressive New York parties. I mean, making him perform in his prison stripes? Poor bastard was still doing time. The point is, I didn't care about the blues. Not many collectors did. We were troubled by its lack of sophistication. You have to remember, a lot of people thought the worst of the Negro in those days. We thought that kind of rough, low-down music only served to confirm color prejudice. A lot of Negroes thought so too, I might add. Church people wouldn't have it in their houses. Anyway, one Saturday I was loitering by the counter at the Apollo, and one of the clerks put on a Charlie Patton Paramount, number 12792, Pony Blues, with Banty Rooster Blues on the flip. You can catch my pony, saddle up my black mare. I'm gonna find a rider, baby in the world somewhere. That sound, my God, like it had come out of the earth. It made my jazz record seem like child's play, like people fooling around in the antechamber, in the vestibule. I asked to hear it again, and they sold it to me for $1. That's how much the Paramounts cost, $1 a piece, all new. The Victors were 50 cents. I took it home and played it 20 times, trying to decipher Patton's words, to hear every eccentric phrase he played on his guitar. Right away, I sold every damn Bix and Paul Whiteman I owned. All I wanted was blues, but the sound I craved wasn't easy to come by. Patton, Son House, Willie McTell, Robert Johnson, Willie Johnson, Skip James, John Hurt. The names were traded by collectors, but no one seemed to know a thing about them. No information, not a scrap. They were like ghosts at the edges of American consciousness. You have to understand when I say no one knew, I mean no one. You couldn't just look something up in a book. Things were hidden. Things got lost. Musicians got lost. I subscribed to record collecting magazines. There was Downbeat and Record Changer, I forget the others. Collectors would run want lists, mostly for jazz. Their contact details were printed on the inside cover. There was one guy with a New York address who only wanted blues, name after name I'd never even heard of, recorded on labels I knew little or nothing about. C. Bly, 179 Division Avenue, Brooklyn 11, NY. Sometimes he wrote letters to the editors correcting some point or offering additional information. His letters were usually more interesting than the articles they responded to. I wrote to him at the address given, saying very humbly that I was a young collector and wanted guidance. What should I listen to? What was out there? He wrote back, enclosing a 3-page typewritten list. Its title was Chester Bly, worthwhile blues records. I corresponded with him for some months before he mentioned an extraordinary thing. He also worked at the Herald Tribune. Of all the people in that warren of a building, the sports reporters and the city reporters and the compositors and copy takers and the rewrite men and the columnists and the printers and the drivers who loaded the papers into their trucks and drove away, we too were the most alike. The next day I got to work early, asked around in the newsroom, did anyone know a Chester Bly? We smoked in those days. I mean, some afternoon the newsrooms looked like dry ice was billowing through it. Rows of men hunkered down over coffee-stained desks, battering at ancient typewriters in the haze. These men worked in a slum of spiked paper and cigarette ash, and I had to run between them, taking paper from one to another, from writer to editor, and back and forth, and over to a sub to write a headline, and downstairs to be set. A monkey could have done it, but they had me, and it was hard work. To get a break, you had to devise strategies, get yourself sent on long errands, that kind of thing. It was late before I had a moment to myself, a moment to walk through the haze to the jumble of desks where the copy editors sat. Mr. Bly? The gaunt man looked up at me from under a green celluloid eye shade. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper and an empty wire basket. Otherwise, the desk was completely clear. That was not normal. I introduced myself. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. I have a lot of corrections to do, he said, but if you're available this evening, perhaps you would care to come by and listen to some music. Of all the people in the building, we two were the most alike. Thank you.
All right, let's keep going for Hari. Sound like an open mic host. So up next we have Margo Jefferson, who wrote this amazing memoir, Negroland, and I just read it this week. I had not read it before. She has this book about Michael Jackson called On Michael Jackson, and it's incredible. It's super weird. Did you know that Michael Jackson was obsessed with P.T. Barnum? And did you just know how messed up P.T. Barnum was? There's a part, I think it happens like, you introduce the part where Michael Jackson, like, he reads this one biography of P.T. Barnum over and over, and then, like, in the next part, it's like, P.T. Barnum, like, he used to bring up people on stage in blackface. So they're just, like, levels to it. So this was her second life. So you're going to talk more about Michael Jackson, and it's going to be problematic, and it's going to be great. Margo Jefferson, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Hari. It's so good to be here. I first came here when it was in its incarnation as the Basement Workshop on the Lower East Side. So this is handsome and lovely and flourishing. So thank you. National Portrait Gallery in London is going to do a Michael Jackson show. Lots of interesting visual artists. In 2018, the news peg is the 30th anniversary of Off the Wall. And I wrote a piece, one of a number of people who wrote a piece for that show. You just keep rethinking the various and refeeling and recalibrating the various Michael Jacksons and the various traditions and whatever rocketing around outside and inside him. So I'm going to read some excerpts from this most recent piece, which I was working on this summer. And why did that happen? I don't know. And the ending is a little rough because this afternoon when I was going over it, I suddenly went back to the opening of Invisible Man. So I'm kind of talking my way through the ending of it. Okay. He stands at the crossroads of multiple readings like some postmodern trickster god. Readings of African American film and performance studies, in post-colonial and queer theory, close critical readings of genre, soul, rock, pop, of technique, the falsetto punch of his gospel woo soothes the long-line ache of his schmaltz balladeering. Dance historians follow his body back to minstrelsy, tap, jazz via Astaire, Kelly, the Nicholas Brothers, Sammy Davis Jr., the soulful struts of James Brown and Jackie Wilson, the popping and breaking of b-boys. Stillness, a step taken and held, a gesture wound up and flung into space, staccato movements that shocked the brain and held the eye, body parts, shoulders, a leg, those long, beautiful fingers, isolated and reconfigured like collage fragments. He stirred wonder, rapture, horror, seizures of love, grief, and longing, every register of ambivalence. In the decades between his first hit in 1969, can anyone name it? I Want You Back. Yes, I do. And his death in 2009, he created and curated himself again and again. First as a precocious Negro boy, then as a daring black man gone solo, then a mysterious man, woman, child of oscillating, liminal race and gender. A spectacle surrounded, embedded in myth, contradiction, transgression. His performances were densely layered self-portraits and cultural portraits, Gothic, expressionistic, noir, soul noir and film noir, Victorian and futuristic, utopian and dystopian. The Little Prince of Soul grew into the king of pop and then became a global sorcerer, magician of metaphor and metatextuality. He wanted to exceed, evade, and ultimately eclipse all certainties, all dualities of race, gender, age, appearance, and species. This business as usual, madam, it is common, the boundaries of being human, most particularly black, male, and human. Boy and man into ghoul and ghost, masculine and feminine into trans or meta-gender, human into robot, animal, tree, fire, water. The power of continual, relentless metamorphosis. Metamorphosis as a fight or flight cultural response. Now I'm going to read brief passages from other writers, which I respond to. This is Hilton Als. Michael Jackson was no mere child with a gift, or to put it more accurately, he was all child, an Ariel of the ghetto, whose appeal lay partly in his ability to find metaphors to speak about his difference. The little enchanter serving adult needs, descendant of the show business pickaninny, the black boy child who used all his skills to serve the adult white performer, often female, longing all the while for the freedom to play howsoe'er he wished. And as Michael grew into an adult, it became clear that he was out to play his version of every lead role the Tempest had to offer. Luminous Miranda, virile Ferdinand, brooding, thwarted Caliban, and Prospero above all, generous, ruthless, omnipotent. It's all there in his aggressive, fantastical garments, in the stage and screen masks, masques, of technological effects, in the illusions, visual, gestural, musical, choreographic, to artists and art forms across continents and centuries. All show his will to transform himself and the world, until his powers were overthrown by both. Catherine Mansfield, don't lower your mask until you have another one in place, as terrible as you like, but a mask. Whenever you look at Michael's face, you see another one of those masks. Beautiful, terrible, fragile, mournful, the long reddened lines of his mouth, the dark eyes enshrined in makeup, the fetish object nose. A globular afro, a cascade of shining locks, a single ringlet centered on his forehead like a caste mark. He's a 16th century Spanish monarch, a romantic poet, clad in a flowing white shirt, blown hither and thither by a wind machine, his pale face offset by his smooth brown chest. Race queasiness and self-loathing, gender queasiness and semi-repressed sexual longing, homosexual longing, Oedipal self-loathing. These were the pervasive narratives while he lived. His death freed up more interpretive space, but I don't want to go into a compensatory version that declares the life and arc narrative of triumph over the binary entrapments of race, gender, and even species. He taunted and teased them. He fled and denied them. He thwarted and bypassed them. He devised subtle and coarse counter-narratives and flagrant subtext. The cost was enormous. His powers were overthrown 10 months into his 50th year. Propofol and lorazepam, along with lesser amounts of multiple other drugs, coursing through his body till it shut down. But when I look at his face, constructed in part with tools and materials familiar to many artists and performers, I find I can separate it from the continual surgeries, the treatments for vitiligo. I can study the artistic effect, the mask of whiteness, simultaneously a mask of blackness, the mask neither male nor female, but within, between, and apart from both. Harlequin, circus clown, African ghost mask, kabuki mask. Wayne Kestenbaum, every body is a civil war. Kestenbaum is speaking of Maria Callas and how she sang that war. Michael Jackson sang, danced, and lived that war. First, his child's body turned into an adolescent. He had to recalibrate its uses and proportions. Then came the years of race, sexuality, gender, and music genre wars. Journalists, scholars, artists, fans, and detractors, white, black, every kind of other, became obsessed with him as the ultimate representation of, refutation of the black male body. History racked and fantasy fraught, suitable for multiple genres, horror, farce, melodrama, and multiple forms of eros. In truth, the black body can be any color, and its phenotypic characteristics are ceaselessly versatile. His singing, dancing, black-white body inherited and appropriated historical. Ooh. Whoa, that is deep. I need to work with that. Historical narratives and performance. But those verbs, inherited, appropriated, don't convey the work performers bring to their art and their personae. He was writing origin myths in flesh and bone. D.H. Lawrence. Never trust the teller, trust the tale. The proper function of a critic is to save the tale from the artist who created it. Historically black performers are like historically black institutions. They are the tales, but the controlling, the dominating, all but omniscient tellers are the whites, backers, sponsors, funders, audiences who surround them. Michael Jackson did all he could to make himself the critic who saved his own tale from the forces who fought to control and thereby create it. He died trying. But he left us. We will never escape the sight, the power, the memory of that fixed, chalk white mask, the mask of the White Death. Thank you.
Skip for Margo again. You guys are so far away. Okay, so we're just gonna chat a little bit, and then we're gonna take some questions later. But because I'm very dumb and you guys are very smart, what is cultural appropriation?
defer to you on that. Straight over to you.
There.
Switched on. Oh, they are switched on.
Are they switched on? Well, this is very much what your book is about, but I would say cultural appropriation is the taking up the usage of another tradition, let us say. Another, it could be a body of performance practices, it could be a language that is very contested and charged. It's not your own, and generally you do not give it credit. You in some way imbibe and cannibalize it. You do not fully acknowledge it. What would you say?
I'll agree with every word of that, and talk about. I mean, the difficulty of it comes at the boundaries. It becomes. It's very easy to understand ownership in a straightforwardly legal way. We have frames like copyright for understanding beneficial ownership. But what happens when it's a tradition? What happens when there are no clear authorities who can legislate what belongs to a group and what
Exactly,
and what
or
does not?
even an origin. You know, the origins of the shimmy, for example. 5 or 6 or 7 people, even all black people, claim it, you know? And then white people start claiming it.
And this is the basis on which people who are hostile to the entire idea claim that it is not a concept that has any meaning.
This is true.
Because it is a concept with fuzzy boundaries, and and so it's an interesting argument to have, because it is something that I think does have a very clear and profound meaning, but which at the same time you have to acknowledge that you'll never access that meaning outside of debate. It'll never end. There's never a founding kind
That's
of
true.
way of adjudicating these
and
questions.
it's so tied to power, many kinds of power, the power of being seen, the power of being acknowledged. And, one reason you'll never fully adjudicate it is, how are the various parties responding to the fact of those power shifts and hierarchies, and also the pleasures and rewards they may give.
Yeah, I mean, with the blues, which is what I've been using to think through precisely this question, you look at what happened when the records made their way across the Atlantic to the young skinny white boys in the 1960s who felt so distant from the producers of this music that they fell in love with, and that they then started covering, that their acts of theft seemed to them victimless crimes until people actually turned up. I mean, some of them were more conscious than others. I mean, the one I find completely shocking is Jimmy Page is auditioning singers for his new band, which is going to be called Led Zeppelin. And he's written a guitar riff, and he auditions this guy, Robert Plant. And Plant just tells him, just sing some words over the top of my guitar line. And Plant doesn't have any words, so he just sings the words from a Muddy Waters song called You've Got Love. And that song becomes Whole Lotta Love, the enormously successful Led Zeppelin hit, which they copyright and they ascribe to themselves. And every single word of the lyric is Muddy Waters. And it is it's not that was a temporarily very distant thing. Yeah. Muddy Waters released that record in 1963, and this session it was 1969. It was, I mean, the equivalent, but the Stones, all these bands, they very unselfconsciously took material that they'd heard, copyrighted it as their own, and then were in many cases surprised years later when either the originators or their relatives turned up to actually remind them that there were human beings behind this disembodied sound.
Remind them with ill-concealed resentment in some cases, yes.
Okay, here's another broad question. Is cultural appropriation, is it always bad?
Well, I think you have to say that without kind of transmission across those cultural boundaries, lots of good things would not happen. But there are often hierarchies at work, and those hierarchies, as you said, are dictated by all sorts of political and social power.
Theft means you steal something and you do not in any way pay for it, right? So it's theft, if, as in the case you cited, that's what goes on. I'm thinking of Janis Joplin. And when she emerged, the rapture, oh my God, this blues, white blues, it's the best thing we've ever heard. And her version, I found it really hard to stick. However, Janis Joplin fully acknowledged not only her worship of Bessie Smith. Yes, it feels a little sentimental to give her a good tombstone, but she didn't have one. She also acknowledged, which you can hear thoroughly in her style, that she owed a great deal to Otis Redding. So, that's respectful. That's appropriation as taking and borrowing, but acknowledging and
So there's a form
attempting
of,
to
like,
pay some.
Respectful theft.
Yeah, well, okay. There can be. Yeah, because it's more than borrowing, isn't it?
I want to ask. You wrote about Janis Joplin in a Harper's piece in the 1970s about what was it called, ripping off black music.
Yeah.
And you made a very interesting case that I wondered whether you'd like to extend into today. I mean, you said the initial version of this is a straightforward kind of minstrelsy. Everybody, back in the day, you put on the burnt cork,
absolutely,
and you pretend,
and you went out there, yeah. And the original story of minstrelsy, the origin story, and it's one, is of the white performer. He's doing nicely, but he sees a little black stable hand doing an interesting little buck and wing kind of step. He says, "I'm gonna teach me this." The guy teaches him this, and then he goes off and makes millions with it. So that's the
first version. Then the second version is the Elvis Presley version, where you don't need the burnt cork anymore. You have the moves, you have the affect, and
and it's more exciting with that white face to many of your white fans.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you in that piece it was very interesting to me, among other things, how distasteful you found Jimi Hendrix. And
I loved him.
But there's a real, you call him a pimp.
What did I say? How did I give something away? I didn't think I did.
No, I mean,
I
was wondering, but you also clearly felt that there was a little bit of shuck and jive going on with setting the guitar on fire and all the kind of that sort of sexy stuff. I didn't think it was minstrelsy, but I did think it was in certain ways playing the primitive, I guess. Yeah, I think that's right. So at that moment, you're writing about Joplin and Hendrix and a group of performers. Who were all using black blues forms, and most of them were white, and you connected that back to Presley and then back into minstrelsy.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see that that's gone forward? I mean, what would you say, looking at, I don't know, Justin Timberlake, Macklemore? where do we go with?
I see very little change, except that Macklemore, pays guilty obeisances constantly.
Let's never forget the Macklemore apology text to Kendrick Lamar.
Exactly.
And the best part of that text, so I think it was like 2012, Kendrick loses the Best Album Grammy to Macklemore, and he sends in this text, and it's just this long text like, "Sorry, dude, I robbed you. You should have won. I robbed you." And my favorite part is he screenshots this and tweets it out or Instagrams it, which is dumb because it's performative, but also like the name that Kendrick is in Macklemore's phone is Kendrick Real. So he must be getting all these fake Kendricks that are always texting him.
So funny. I love it. Kendrick Real. But part of what I can't completely divide my sense that has it progressed? Do you think it's progressed? From the sameness of the critical response. Whether it's Eminem, well, particularly if it's Eminem, people tend to patronize Justin Bieber or Justin Timberlake a little bit. But that's not because of race. That's because they think these guys are a little too shallow for their critical sensibility. But, when Eminem emerged, it was really many of the critics who were irritating the life out of me because time and again they would say, he's intelligent, he's complex, and they did not even hear themselves. That trope going back to jazz writing also. In your Big Spiderback section, the 20s jazz critics, white ones, would openly say things like, they have passion and emotion and this incredible instinctive talent on their side, we have intelligence and thought on our side.
I mean, that trope, as you say, turns up again and again and again. It turns up in the classroom as well. I had to referee in a workshop fairly recently, the white student saying of the black student's prison narrative, like, I don't know why you have him speak like that, because he's actually very intelligent. And so this whole, I mean, yeah, I mean, the whites as possessors of formal brilliance and a kind of conscious artistry versus the
irony, such as Macklemore.
and the instinctive travels of rhythm on the other side.
So we've been talking about cultural appropriation, and it seems like usually when we have this conversation, we're mostly talking about music, even though many forms of things can be culturally appropriated. What is it with music that's why our conversation is centered around that?
I mean, I think there's a very particular history of the reception of African American music internationally. I mean, think of what happened to blues music to become rock and roll, which is now a vernacular that is completely international, and the same thing has happened to hip hop. I was just reading about the pro and anti Chinese government Chinese hip hop scene, which was a new one on me.
Yes.
But was somebody, I should tweet that piece out because it's a really fascinating thing. Where were we? Yes, I think music has this very particular history because it's been. I mean, certainly for me, that was my gateway into all the rest of African American culture. I grew up in a white suburb in London with it was a very peculiar place. It was a very sort of racist place. There were no black people around, but there was a strange history of loving soul music. And then into the early 80s, there was suddenly hip hop and what we called electro, all the kind of synthetic stuff happened as well. So we were all trying to spin on our heads on bits of lino and singing "It's Like a Jungle Sometimes." It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. And then I remember I got hold of a record called "The Crown" by Gary Bird, who was a radio DJ, and which had all this kind of list of Afrocentric heroes, most of whom I'd never heard of. And so that started me at the age of 12 on to eventually ending up having to write that novel.
I would also say that for black people, we knew that, yes, we had literature, yes, we had art, but we knew that our music and our popular music was, what had claimed a kind of world dominance, that was there, and we could talk and glory in that and imitate it and write about it in a way we really couldn't. We did not have to feel second class in any way. Actually, black dance has been just about as influential, but there are far fewer. That's partly again critical. There's much less dance criticism knocking around. It's harder in some ways to be a dance writer than to kind of be an adjective-strewn, wow, gorgeous. And also you can't collect in the sense, the institutions of amateur collecting don't.
How do you record dance?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's dependent on live performance, yeah.
I think there's a moment in Negroland which seems to be the flip side of many things that I experienced in this sort of suburban childhood, where I was, we've got the music, where are the musicians, where are the people who made this? Where you talk about coming into adolescence and realizing that your blackness gave you a sort of, you call it something like a bohemian cachet. Suddenly you realize that was in the mix as to how people were responding to you.
And ironically, you always nail the touchy things, like also Jimi Hendrix. That partly came about through, the kind of lame, I never liked Lead Belly, but that lame, I never liked Odetta, but that lame folk scene kind of gave you that. But it really came about when Chicago, bourgeois boys, some of whom I was at the same private school with, like Paul Butterfield, were getting attention playing
Paul Butterfield blues
band.
And
the blues band.
Yeah.
We were I was a pre-freshman, he was a senior, we were even in some school talent show together, and He imported Mike Bloomfield from a nearby school, and they did. You know, I was born in Chicago in 1941. And I thought, oh, God. You know, I was at that point a rock and roll and soul and jazz fan, but I would listen, I would hear blues on the black station, and I thought, okay, you know, I am this bourgeois little girl, but I have, you know, this is giving me a certain bohemian power. That being bourgeois, I wonder if you experience this in a bourgeois white world. I did not always have, because the black people they were really interested in were supposed to be more down, funky, and primitive, unless you were essentially almost invisible, except as someone like them.
Margo, what did you do at the talent show?
Well, I believe I was part of a number from The Music Man. And we did a lot of group, you know, dramatizations of things like T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Man. It was something called a voice-speaking choir. It was popular in America, especially the Midwest.
Well, the performance thing that Nick, I was looking at Negroland the other day, and it sent me to YouTube videos and to Eartha Kitt doing Monotonous.
Oh, God.
And
Isn't it divine?
It's fantastic, and I had not heard it before. And it has such a sort of particular place in your family. I mean, you tell the story about Eartha Kitt snubbing your parents.
Not being the only person from in this otherwise all-white cast who didn't come to a party my parents gave. She said, "I don't need these Negroes who look down on me because I'm bohemian." Yeah, that's what she said.
But then this song is this kind of performance of her kind of snubbing this person, that person, and the guy who's the Stork Club
that's right.
owner.
That's right. Jack Fathman. That's Sherman Billingsley cooks for me.
I found that monotonous.
Monotonous. That's right. That's right. Let's see. Shanghai Shek sends me pots of tea. Sherman Billingsley sends me vitamin D. And furthermore, Ike, President Eisenhower, likes me. Monotonous. Yeah.
So the name of this event, I believe, is Race, Music, Ghost Stories, which is just a bunch of nouns in a row. So Hari, I really have a question. Like, you wanted to write a novel about cultural appropriation. Why did you also put it in the vessel of a ghost story?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so I mean, the moment where the novel really started for me was the day after the first that Obama got elected. And I'd been right downtown at a party full of English book people who weren't getting why this was a thing. And I got into a cab and I was like, I need to see what this means. And I went to 125th and whatever. And so there was a kind of massive party uptown. And the next day I look at the TV and the newspapers, and I see we have now entered a post-racial America again and again and again and again.
We did it.
Yeah, it was like,
that's right.
And now we never have to think about any of that stuff ever again. And I was like, dude, like one guy, he's one Hawaiian guy, and you're done. And so. And I was like, that is indecently hasty. That is, you guys are trying to slam the trapdoor on something that you don't want to look at, and you're worried that there's something still under there, you know. And what are ghost stories? Ghost stories are always stories about something from the past that has been repressed, that has been prematurely buried, often literally prematurely buried. You know, the hand comes up out of the grave. And this seemed to me what America was desperate to do with its racial past, and it was like a tell. All those liberal commentators hailing the post-racial American moment was a huge tell about the anxiety of having to face history. And at that point, I was like, this is a ghost story. This is a country that is haunted by something, and it is haunted by this past. And at the same time, I'd been listening to a lot of blues music for years, and blues has become such a hollowed out, colonized, dead form of music. It's the music from the Budweiser beer advert. If you want to signify down home rural America, the real America. You put a guy in Dickies overalls on a porch, and you give him a guitar, and he sings a blues song, and that's all that is. And the idea of this sort of evacuated music, the shell of a form that could be reanimated, that its sort of its ghostliness could be revivified. That was the origin of that.
The obsession, the way you keep documenting and dramatizing these obsessions, that's so.
Well, all this
so
thing about
fascinating.
ownership and control, and I mean, the more I found out about the collecting scene around blues, the more powerful it seemed to be, because, record collectors, as we all know, are crazed and dangerous people. I mean, collectors of every kind are obsessive. But the record collectors of 78 records have a particular kind of cultural power, because this music, especially the blues music, was recorded by small fly-by-night labels that didn't keep archives, that don't have any institutional continuity into the present day. So there are no masters, there are no wax discs. There's nothing other than the records themselves. So if you are in possession of the only clean copy of Stones in My Pathway by Robert Johnson, and it's hugely important cultural document. Everyone has to come to you if they want to remaster that, if they want to re-release that. I mean, people don't tend to assert copyright ownership, because usually there are several copies floating around, but in some cases there is one copy. And if you're the person who controls that one copy, everybody has to come to your door, and that gives them an enormous gatekeeping power. And there's a very small number of, by and large, white guys, older guys now, since the people who have good collections have been doing it since the 50s and 60s, who know where all the records are. They have very complicated and usually extremely antagonistic relationships to each other, and they are putting together often really fiendish schemes to try and complete. I mean, if my thing is jug bands and your thing is female singers, then and I know that if I have this Bessie Smith, then you can get me this Memphis Jug Band record, but maybe you'll also want me to throw in blood. They do a lot of that. They do a lot of trying to kind of stop each other getting information. I mean, when I first started trying to kind of find out about the collecting scene, the first person I contacted was a collector who lives on the Lower East Side here, and he responded politely but very firmly. He said, "It is not in my interests to speak to you about this, because the more people who know about this material, the harder it will be for me to build my collection." And that, to me, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Like, the kind of, if I love something, I have the impulse to just shake people by the lapels and say, "Listen to this." And he got to the point where he just wanted to be alone in his room with his things.
I have one more question before we move on to audience questions. Margo, so you wrote an entire book about Michael Jackson over a decade ago. You're still writing about Michael Jackson. In some ways, like, Michael Jackson is like a specter. Like, that's almost in itself a ghost story. What's enduring? What keeps bringing you back to Michael Jackson?
Well, I don't go back every year or every week, but first of all, I think often when you write a book, it's certainly criticism. It's what you didn't do enough of, or what you think you got wrong, or what you didn't think and feel your way fully enough through. So, you want to get that back. Also, I was enthralled to the same obsessions and puzzlements and, that everyone else was. You can't pretend as a critic, you can try to put that into a language of some kind of understanding, but you can't escape it, and I look back at that and I think, ooh, was I having trouble with that? Oh, was I struggling? Oh, was I being punitive?
I mean, do you feel there's a sort of betrayal in calling him a victim? Do you think that was is that a hard thing to say about him?
I think he was a victim, but I think the arrogance with which so many people called him a victim of total racial self-hatred, or I think that was a little too simplistic. I think there were many demonic and frightening things driving him, but I think, in other ways he was also as proud and, proud to claim his traditions and his blackness as many people I know. So I just think it's deeply entangled.
There's a lot of noses. There's a lot of noses in Negroland. There's a lot of thinking about noses.
Yes, and skin color.
Describing noses.
So I was fixated on his nose, but he was fixated on his nose too. And those things are very hard to write about because they implicate you. And if you pretend they don't, then your tone goes wrong. I think.
Yeah, I mean, with anything like this, you have to put yourself in play, don't you? You have to acknowledge that you're shot through with all the contradictions and all the complexities.
Which your narrator, in some way, really did do. He paid, and that was fine. He needed to pay.
It was interesting. Some, especially in Britain, some critics were really uncomfortable with the idea that there was an excessive payment.
Oh, how
that it went over and above anything that they'd done.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Was there any criticism? Not criticism. Was there any questioning? There's a tradition of questioning the writer of color who creates white characters. Did any of that come up in critical responses to your book? Even you're saying that they thought the price was excessive. Makes me think of that.
There was a certain amount of are you just racist? I mean, that's something that people throw at me if I speak too strongly as a person of color on the internet. Let's say, I mean, in the title, "White Tears" is a provocation, clearly, but the idea that I was indulging in a racial revenge fantasy. On behalf of a bunch of other people, it was like kind of...
It's a selfless revenge fantasy.
Just providing a public service, the revenge fantasy that you wouldn't maybe be allowed to write.
Funny. Yeah.
White Tears by Quentin Tarantino. Yeah. All right, let's do questions from you guys. I think Sophie's going to run around with the mic.
Someone right at the back has a hand
Just
up.
making it as difficult as possible, right in the back.
2 hands, right.
Hi, Harry and Margo. I really appreciate you taking your time to talk to us tonight. So the question I have is going to be a little controversial. It's related to the issue of cultural appropriation. So one of the biggest problems that I notice is that while there is a lot of good discourse going around the topic, there are some toxic people who do misappropriate cultural appropriation for their own goals. A good example of this would be Chinese propaganda arms using the recent circumscribing of Chinese hip hop on Chinese television stations by saying that inherently Chinese people can't do justice to black hip hop, and that art form just isn't going to be able to be done in China appropriately. That was their excuse. That was done in the Global Times. Another issue I found is that a lot of times people will say that if, let's say, a black person engages in something like Taekwondo and makes it actually a profession, or if an Asian person perhaps sings Western opera, there have been people who bring that up. This is cultural appropriation. This is inappropriate. And so, of course, this is going to be something that's going to be extremely controversial, and every person is going to have their own opinion. But how do we make it something a lot more cogent and coherent rather than something that could be used by anyone for whatever, God knows what their purpose is, whatever, thing they have for,
As a weapon at hand for
yes.
whatever, yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that the language of what gets called identity politics has now been weaponized from the white right. I mean, we've seen this as part of as a major feature of our politics recently. And I mean, coming from a British context, we've had a lot of discussions for a generation now about multiculturalism and the idea of a sort of positive politics of culture as being a way for Britain to overcome a colonial past and kind of move into a new era. And there was a time when I was very optimistic about that. I mean, I think I was a beneficiary during the 90s as a young guy coming out of a moment when everybody seemed to be like, oh yeah, this is quite nice. There's lots of like people of color who are also really British and chicken tikka masala and then it went really ugly and it went really ugly because cultural conservatives of various stripes realized that they could use it in a defensive way. You could say, I have a culture, you have no right to define my culture, and I say that my culture is, you can't tell me not to do female genital mutilation, you can't tell me not to do X, Y, and Z, and you have to respect me, even though so what it was supposed to be was we were all gonna masala it up, and we were gonna move forward into a kind of new set of forms where these kind of warlike divisions were not going to pertain. And instead what we got was a lot of people in the trenches kind of sniping at each other, and the government foolishly, or various kind of well-meaning white folks trying to kind of referee the whole thing. And I think there's some of that in the identity politics that's going on now in the US, in the the category that really needs to be interrogated is whiteness, really. There is absolutely zero problem with a Scots-Irish person having deep pride in their roots and heritage in the way that anybody else would. But the claim of whiteness, as we all know, is a kind of default, as a norm, as a kind of, as a standard against which the rest of us deviate to various degrees, is the problem here. And that's an abstraction. It's not a thing you can be proud of per se. It's a kind of weird intellectual byproduct of a couple hundred years of many hundreds of years of craziness. I'm drifting now. I'm now kind of just giving a lecture, but you say some stuff.
I don't know. I don't know what I could add. I think that's I think your account is very much to the point. But how we stop it, how we get the thinking and the language expansive yet precise, and useful rather than punitive, and deliberately meant, again, to be a power struggle. I don't know.
When I'm asked about cultural appropriation and music, the sort of, quick and dirty division that I give is there's a difference between loving something and trying to own it. And
Okay.
And I think if you want to say something like, John Coltrane is a great artist, so therefore you must want to say that John Coltrane can speak outside his time and place and beyond the kind of initial boundaries of which he arose in. So he has to have that universalism, i.e., everybody gets to listen to John Coltrane and love John Coltrane. That doesn't mean that everybody has the same kind of ability to interpret and define what John Coltrane means universally, let us say.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
You'll co-sign that?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, well, we're done here tonight. Thank you very much.
Co-signing it. Look at, again, someone like Michael Jackson, and there are many, many examples. He was appropriating from all kinds of artists and traditions, sometimes people he did not, like whoever the young black man who taught him the moonwalk, supposedly, unnamed and I think perhaps uncredited and maybe unpaid, but let's hope not. There was a period, there is a school of people who would say that there's a kind of Puritanism that blacks can also engage in about what it is appropriate, what styles, what traditions black people should appropriately practice. Not appropriate, but appropriately practice. They should not necessarily appropriate certain classical music forms or opera forms. That I find that kind of prohibiting very, very tiresome too. So I want that to be opened up and exploded. But that's for us to all do between and among ourselves as we are putting white people through their paces and making them more sensible and intelligent. That was a little glib.
Who else has got a question? Up front here. We're just going to make you run back and forth. Someone should raise their hand in the back next.
So I have a question. I think Margo said something about if you are a critic, you're saving the work from the artist or from...
Oh, that was D.H. Lawrence.
D.H. Lawrence did, rather. And I think something was mentioned about sort of white stakeholders and white audience members and white editorial processes and all of this. So my question is, if that's what you're tasked with as a critic, and you're a critic of color, are there any sort of axiomatic or like first principles around what to do, best practices, or is it just like you take it as it comes on a case-by-case basis?
First of all, are you doing, and I do want to say with the D.H. Lawrence quote, the part of it that people really use most is trust the tale, not the teller. The point being that artists so often have their own self-serving narratives, which can be protective coloration or can even simplify the story. The second part of the quote, which is also his, is used less often because it's trickier. But first of all, what's the range of work that you are writing about? And I find that one needs different personae for that. So that would be my first question. Do you plan to write about Black work exclusively?
No, not necessarily.
No. All right. So you want to think about what's your? Are you writing about literature? Are you writing? What's your relationship to these art forms as an intellectual, an emotional, a political, an aesthetic person? You're constantly asking yourself that. Why? What's pushing buttons? Your buttons. What's setting you off in ways that really, if you ask yourself, that's too comfortable. Oh, I never like that kind. Oh, I'm never interested in that. Oh, that's boring. What are you trying to protect and preserve when you write that has to do with, your own ego, your own vanity? And always be questioning that. And how do you open yourself up to the work at the same time that you are, trying to give sense and shape to describing it, and to analyzing it. But I would also say that there's as much authority to ambivalence and to vulnerability and to questioning, as there is to that kind of, summary judgment. Mm-hmm. That's crucial, I would say, especially if you are a critic of color.
Thank you so much.
Seems like a thing that keeps coming up in this conversation is the idea of motive, not just, like the outside motive, but sort of like a self-interrogation, it seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly from my point of view, and I said earlier, unless you are in play in some way, and unless you're going to your own queasy or difficult or problematic places, then there's a sort of deadness. Then you're just being performative. There has to be a difficulty and a self-exposure in what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's fiction, nonfiction. Yeah, absolutely.
Question?
I once heard Cornel West say something really interesting, which is that when he came of age as a Black intellectual, he really had no doubt that Black intellectual life was in some way superior because it had a kind of moral authority, which derived in part from the civil rights movement. I think Cornell would say also from the church, but that there was this deep confidence there. I don't think he thinks young people have that, but I think he thinks his generation did. And I wonder if that might be something that is true of music as well. So when you listen to somebody like Amy Winehouse, very intelligent girl, by the way, I'm joking. She's...
Don't diss Amy.
I'm sorry, I'm
like
going
Amy.
to, Harry. She's white North London girl whose dad doesn't approve of her heroin addict boyfriend, but she's using a musical language that has a kind of moral authority because it's a language of suffering that comes from people who just suffered in a different way. Isn't that part of the problem with cultural appropriation, that there's a kind of moral center to it?
But this seems to me to get to something really important about the specific reception of black music, is that it's the suffering that's the catnip. It's that's the stuff you want. That's the real. And the adoption of those forms and the adoption of the poses and the paradigmatic, the white suburban boy who wants to be street. You could say in some way that Amy Winehouse actually, her suffering was fairly authentic in the end, but the forms she was using were the kind of the Billy-ish, black outsider forms. I mean, that wish to get the juice without paying the price for it is very much at the heart of the novel that I wrote. I wanted to sort of show that if you want to be the Norman Mailer-esque white Negro, you don't just get to kind of have all the cool stuff. You have the terror of being outside the protection of the law.
Beautifully put. I would also say that there was also some of Amy Winehouse's music was being drawn in an entertaining and shallow way from forms of black music that were entertaining and shallow.
The girl groups stuff.
I love Motown, but a lot of it's entertaining and shallow, and a lot of the Motown performers, they are beautifully, they're not major talents. I've been, for my own purposes, thinking a lot about and writing something about not Tina Turner, whom I've written about, but Ike Turner, like Jay-Z. At moments, I guess I'm Ike Turner. But I'm not, there is a story, there is a life story there for both of them that involves, suffering, hard times. You look at those early songs of theirs, and it's funky, very cool sex comedy. That's what it is. And it is funky, and they can both give off a kind of hip, cool danger, but, we're not talking deep suffering there. Not in those, I think it's going to work out fine. Not in those hit Proud Mary. No. So, I think it's important, and I'm not, saying, don't be. I think it's important for us to make those distinctions also. They help. Hopefully they will help lessen that need to feed off, the catnip of the black pain all the time.
Cool. Let's just do one more question and we'll call it a night. We got one in the back. Two in the back. It's your call.
Why don't we just take them together? We'll do one after the other, and then you pick.
Okay, I just have a quick question about when we talk about cultural appropriation and stuff like that. We don't really get into like blues music came from the church, and how people appropriated it from the church. Because I noticed when you talk to people in the church, they kind of took offense to some of the music, because it went from praising God to talking about sex, or talking about divorce, or talking about abortion, or stuff that's going on in real life. So
I think you make a really good point about black forms, that take from each other. I would say there are very strong links between blues and church, and gospel singers, are among the greatest black singers. But the three-line blues form, it did not come out of the church. So there are ways in which it has its own tradition, even though there are overlaps and there's a lot of conflict.
And just one quick question. When you talk about record collectors, what kind of records are they collecting? They're collecting 78s?
Yeah, I mean the records of the 20s and 30s were they were made out of shellac. They're made out of crushed beetles.
Right,
and
the 78 ones, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
With those, wow, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for being so generous with your time. Speaking of ghost stories and hauntings, I wanted to share that I'm quite haunted by an experience summer 2013 when I was lucky enough to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and be part of the Memory Palace exhibition. And I was just curious if, Hari, if you are haunted by that exhibit or if you meant to portend a future that arrived sooner than you might think that it would.
Wow, amazing you saw that. That was a great thing that I was allowed to do. I was approached by the V&A to write a story that would be delivered as a show, as a walk-in space. They commissioned I think kind of 20-ish artists and designers to respond to different parts of this text, and I wrote them. I was thinking it's a museum. It's this sort of treasure house of artifacts, and it's all about memory. And I wrote them a piece of dystopian futurism about a world where, a future where all forms of kind of recording and memorialization had been either wiped out and were now kind of banned. I mean, that was a. I don't know what to say other than that. Other than I had a great time doing that. But I mean that in working in the context of a museum is you are engaged with culture in a very different way, and there's a fair bit of appropriation in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Let me tell you, there's been some collecting from some different places, but. Yeah, I mean they didn't let me kind of put stuff from the collection in there. Otherwise, I would have had like Tipu's tiger and things going on in there that I would have liked to have responded to.
Cool. I think that does it for us. Let's give Hari and Margo a round of applause.
And
all right. Thanks everyone for coming. Buy books. Greenlight Bookstore has copies of Negroland and White Tears. So.